Let's move on to the Indianapolis Colts here. And obviously, the biggest piece on this offense that they brought in was Matt Ryan. It's going to be quite possibly completely change what we have seen before from the Colts. But the focal point of that offense, Matt Ryan brought in, whoever you bring in, that focal point of that offense is Jonathan Taylor. AJ, what will his workload look like, though, with Matt Ryan being there? Because it obviously still most likely going to be the focal point, but what does Matt Ryan do to Jonathan Taylor's workload?
I think it kind of helps preserve him, actually. Not saying that they're going to just stop using him or anything, but if you recall last season, as Carson Wentz kind of went downhill, they started to rush the ball a lot more until the game that it mattered, and they tried to let him prove it all. But so I think you're going to see him carry the ball a little less. I mean, last season he had 332 touches. I think you may see something this year like 315, 320. But the other thing is, I think he gets involved a little more in the passing game, and I think that's something Frank Reich talked about wanting to see, because he proved he can do it. Last season he had, I think it was 40 receptions on 51 targets. This is a guy who can catch the ball. And the thing that Matt Ryan does better than Carson Wentz is he'll get to his check down a lot quicker. He might notice his check down before the snap. And Carson Wentz will take the deep bomb and hope his receiver gets it rather than check it down. Whereas Matt Ryan will go through those progressions and more than likely make the right play. And granted, this year he'll have the time to do that. And even though it's not the last year's offensive line, it's still 20 times better than what Atlanta's offensive line was last season. So I think you see him. I expect Jonathan Taylor to have like something like 8 or 9 more catches than he did last season, and probably like 15 to 20 less catches. And as Aaron says, I do believe Nyheim Hines will be back in this offense, kind of like he was when Phillip Rivers was there, another quarterback who would find his checkdowns as running backs. And they do this so that way next season you're not just using up Jonathan Taylor. He can come back if all was healthy and do the same thing again.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the route that you took on that, because even though Matt Ryan may bring more pass attempts to this offense, most likely will, Jonathan Taylor is still that dude, and it's going to preserve him to where it could be to the point where he ends up doing even more work and giving you more fantasy production than what he did last year. Obviously, it's tough to be able to duplicate what he did last year, and you might see that regression, but it's not going to be that drastic. Jonathan Taylor is still going to be that dude. And obviously, like, you talk about Jonathan Taylor, it's like, why are you talking about him? He's going to be one of the top, probably a top 5 running back. It's just what Matt Ryan does to his workload is the biggest point here. Aaron, are you on you're okay with everything that we just said with that? Or are you thinking over there?
For the most part, listen, there's one thing that just scares me. It's the amount of touches in the NFL that don't carry over from year to year. And it's not that Jonathan Taylor can't handle a workload, but you're talking about a guy who got 360 touches, something like that, 370 touches last year. That amount of touches by a running back just can't sustain. Like, I believe there's only usually 3 or 4 guys every year that go over like 300 touches. Most of these guys are 220, 230 carries, 50 catches, around 280, get upwards of almost 300. Jonathan Taylor was almost at 400. I don't see a year where they do that to him again. This is not a team. They weren't successful. Let's be honest. They weren't successful actually doing it. They didn't even make the playoffs. He was successful, but as a team, they weren't successful. They were trying to protect Carson Wentz. And in doing so, they put a lot on Jonathan Taylor, and he had a hell of a season. But this year, I don't think they feel the need to protect Matt Ryan in that way. I think they look at Matt Ryan as a guy, this guy's won an MVP. He's been to a Super Bowl. I think they feel comfortable saying, you know what, Matt Ryan can go and win us a game, and we don't have to worry about not letting him throw the ball 30 to 35 times if we can keep him upright. So I think that Jonathan Taylor's touches do come down this year. Does it mean his production comes down? No. But I do think that when we look at fantasy, we have to be careful when looking at a guy that just went for 1,800 yards, almost 20 touchdowns, or total of 20 touchdowns, and say it's going to happen again. Because if he loses, say he loses 20 carries, and he catches, an extra 10 balls like AJ said. There could be and maybe he doesn't score 20 touchdowns again this year. Maybe Matt Ryan actually throws for more touchdowns this year. That's going to bring those numbers down. So I just worry about having those same expectations from what the number one overall player did year after year when you're bringing in a new quarterback like Matt Ryan.
Yeah. I think you see him come to about 1450 in yards and maybe around 14, 15 touchdowns, maybe falls in. I don't see 18 and 18 or 18 and 20 again. I agree. It's hard to sustain. That's a crazy number. I mean, Derrick Henry literally had to run over the NFL to do it twice. So, and we know Jonathan Taylor, he's more shifty. He can show the power, but I agree. I definitely think it's going to come down. You should expect that. The other crazy thing too is even as a number one fantasy option last year at running back, he only averaged 22 points a game. That's like the lowest number one overall stat since like 2016, I think, maybe 17. So
it's because the running back position is so down and they're always beat up.
Yeah.
There is no more like we have 7 bell cows and you know what I mean? They're all going to play 15, 16 games. Like these guys don't play that, a full season and it's too hard. So when you get a guy that does play a full season, I mean, you're fortunate. A full season could be like 15, 16 games because most don't play all 17.
Right.
Yeah. So we talk about the usage of Jonathan Taylor and now Michael Pittman, on the other hand, as a wide receiver. AJ, you had him third on your list, arguably at 2. Aaron, you would have possibly had him as the number 1 wide receiver in this AFC South. Last season, when you look at when the Colts started to really ramp up on the production and the usage of Jonathan Taylor, we saw Michael Pittman's stats start to drop. His first 10 games, 729 yards, 5 touchdowns, 33 receptions on 53 targets. Very good first 10 games. But when the Colts started using Jonathan Taylor and started really relying on him, we saw Michael Pittman's stats drop. And that's maybe an obvious thing to say. But now they bring in Matt Ryan, and that might be a big-time difference maker for Michael Pittman Jr. Aaron, what is the ceiling and what is the floor for Michael Pittman?
The ceiling is a wide receiver 1. The floor is a wide receiver 2.
That's a good floor.
Oh, he is a great floor. This is a guy that is going to be a fantasy asset. He's going to be productive. He's a huge big body threat. The problem at the end of the season last year wasn't really his usage. He didn't score any touchdowns. I believe from week 10 to week 18, he didn't score a touchdown. A lot of that had to do with Carson Wentz. He's not going to be a guy that's going to go out and get you like 10 catches, 140 yards. That's not really what he does. That's not how that offense really works. It's similar to the Tennessee offense. As a running back who's going to get most of the looks, Michael Pittman's going to have to score touchdowns. And I think with Matt Ryan, it makes it a lot easier. But remember, he still has 0 competition in the passing game. He is the number 1 target, the only guy that has any real experience offensively on the outside, and a veteran quarterback who has a history of throwing to receivers with his build. Big body guys that can go up and get it, that is not afraid to fit it into tight windows, which fits Michael Pittman's game. He is their number 1. He is their number 2. And then Nyheim Hines is probably their number 3. So I think Michael Pittman this year is primed to have I don't even know if I'd call it a breakout season because I thought last year was close to his breakout year. But I think this year you could be looking at a guy that goes for close to 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns.
So what about, and AJ, you know this very well because of Matt Ryan and his days with the Atlanta Falcons. There was that time, and I'm not going to make the comparison of Michael Pittman Jr. and Julio Jones, but there was a time where a lot of people were very upset because Julio Jones would get everything but touchdowns. So you talk about the problems of Michael Pittman Jr. last year of not being the guy who scored the touchdowns, but just being the guy of getting yards. It is oddly similar to what Julio Jones was with Matt Ryan and the Falcons.
No, not the same. First of all, Atlanta's offense had a problem because Atlanta would never go to Julio Jones in the red zone. That was the biggest gripe with them, is they'd always go elsewhere. They would never force feed Julio in the red zone. They'd force feed him 20 to 20 and then go somewhere else, and he wouldn't score any touchdowns. that might be one of the biggest like fantasy misconceptions about a guy. It's like, it's like Julio Jones. Oh, he never scores any touchdowns. His first 2 years in the league, he had 8 and 10 touchdowns. He had 2 other years where he scored 8 touchdowns. Like it was just they expected more because he had such big yardage numbers. He didn't score a lot of touchdowns because they didn't run plays for him in the red zone. I don't feel that way about Michael Pittman. And I'll be honest, Michael Pittman's probably a better red zone threat than Julio Jones. The way he's built, he's just that he goes and gets it. He's that big body guy that just goes and gets it. He's built for the red zone. And last year, again, Carson Wentz, it's all off the table when Carson Wentz is your quarterback.
So I think
I can't trust it.
I think this is really funny about how like Matt Ryan coming in and then what they have with Carson Wentz. Last year, the Indianapolis Colts threw a total of 521 pass attempts. Matt Ryan hasn't thrown less than 529 pass attempts since 2009. So the majority
second year
of
in the league.
His second year in the league. So Matt Ryan is he likes to throw the ball, and that's what he's been known to do in Atlanta. So like and that's why I brought up the thing with Jonathan Taylor is because you don't just bring in Matt Ryan to have him throw the exact amount of times or less than what they did with Carson Wentz. You bring him in to change this offense because you have to compete in this NFL to throw. So that does alter what Jonathan Taylor does, and it also bumps up what Michael Pittman does. I do see a high-end wide receiver 2, fringe wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 type of season for Michael Pittman Jr. with Matt Ryan. Let's go to the Houston Texans.
Wait. I wanted to say one more thing about the comparison you made, which you brought up a really good point. Matt Ryan throws that way because Matt Ryan is checking at the line of scrimmage when there's too many guys in the box. Matt Ryan is being able to read defense and say, you know what? I know this play is designed for Jonathan Taylor, but I see a hole in the defense and I'm going to expose it. Carson Wentz, I don't know that he had the free reign to do that from a Frank Wright. Frank Wright was like, I know we got to keep you reined in. You turn around, you hand the ball off until I tell you to throw it. That's not going to be the case with Matt Ryan. This guy has so much experience. He is going to throw the ball because the matchups, when defenses are stacking the box, he's going to check out of the run and he's going to throw the ball to Michael Pittman or whoever.
AJ, you look irritated. What are you talking about? What's wrong?
Because
he's mad because I'm talking about his boy Carson Wentz.
No. Because the one time Matt Ryan should have checked, we would have won a damn Super Bowl, but he didn't.
But think about that. He should have checked to what? A run play. He didn't. He was still throwing the ball. Everybody was saying, why don't you run the ball? Matt Ryan's mentality was no, they're playing a certain way. This is the right play. It's this. And 2 Super Bowl conversations, we can talk about this. The Matt Ryan, obviously against the Patriots when he decided to throw the ball and take the sack. And then the Seattle play, which they didn't give the ball to Marshawn Lynch, were both plays where Matt Ryan didn't check and Russell Wilson did check out of a run from a run play to a pass play. There's 2 formations they came out with. They ran the pass play because the defense dictated what they wanted you to do. Veteran quarterbacks do that because as a coach, you trust a process. It's not about pass or run. It's about what is the defense giving you? Make the appropriate play. Your job is to execute that play. Matt Ryan tried. Yes, in hindsight, it was bad. He took a sack. He shouldn't have. That's the bad play. Not necessarily the throw, but the fact that he took the sack was the bad play. So, but we only remember the stuff that cost you Super Bowls. The point
I
is,
was talking
Matt
about
Ryan's
earlier when they went to Julio on 3rd and 9 on the right side of the field, and you run the ball instead, and the clock runs down, and they may not have enough time to get to overtime. But that's a whole other conversation that I really don't want to revisit. So we can move on to the Houston Texans. That's right. I want to talk about the 4-13 Houston Texans more than I want to talk about my damn Atlanta Falcons.